welcome to a special on-location bookmark from the Franciscan University of Steubenville. And our guest author is Mr. Mike Aquilina. Hi, Mike. Great to have you here.
Doug, it's great to be here.
Who, along with Cardinal Donald Wuerl, has written the book, The Church, Unlocking the Secrets to the Places Catholics Call Home, and also authors of the book, The Mass. So this is actually, what, the second time you've worked with the Cardinal?
This is the second book. We conceived it as a three-part series. The Cardinal is very much committed to restoring the foundations of Catholic life, really. A lot was lost in the 60s and 70s. He's talked about that in many interviews, that people lost touch with the roots of the faith, with the basics, the doctrine, the practices, and we want to reconnect them with that.
Now, did you know him, because he came out, he was here in Pittsburgh at one time, so did you know him before he...
I did. I knew him because he was my bishop, but also because I worked for him for 3 years.
Oh, you did? Okay.
In the early 90s, I was editor of the diocesan newspaper in Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm. And he's always been doing media, because he had that book, To Teach Us Christ, right?
The Teaching of Christ, right? Was his catechism, and he's done several other books. And also he had a
television, right?
Television show for, I think, 17 years he did the television show on KDKA.
Right, exactly. So this book is The Church, and it's kind of interesting because... And you talk about it, the word the church means so many things to so many different people, you know, between the building or the body of Christ. How do you mean it in this book?
In this book, we mean it as the place where we go to worship. And that's the way most people know the church. They know it as the place where they gather on Sundays, usually, and holy days, and where they meet up with other Catholics and where they receive the body and blood of Christ. And Catholics have a lot of affection for their church. We started with the Mass, our first book, and then the Church as our second book, because these are the places, the times when Catholics plug into their faith and where they live them in an especially intense way, and they're universal experiences. Mm-hmm.
Now, there's also been, and you kind of talk about it in this book, the whole idea, and you kind of lay out the whole aspects of the church, different things of the church. But the churches, you know, we see St. Peter's, or we say the great cathedrals, Notre Dame, or whatever. Then we see some of the very interesting looking churches that were built in the 60s and the 70s were much different. We saw altar rails come in and go out. We saw altars be turned around, or in some cases turned into things that look more like a table per se. So how does that all relate to one another? How is it different? How is one supposed to see that?
Well, I travel a lot for my work, and I'm in a lot of different churches, a lot of different kinds of churches, and every now and then you walk into a church and you say, oh, that's beautiful, that's stunning. And yet you say that about a lot of different kinds of churches. You know, some of them are very ornate, some of them are very elaborate, some of them are very simple. Sometimes it's the piety of the people inside that really shakes you up. So there are a lot of different reasons why you do that. What we tried to concentrate on the book is the basics again. What are the things that all of these churches have in common?
Regardless of how the architecture might be.
What are the components that are necessary for a Catholic church? Why do we build these buildings in the first place? So we try to look at that purpose, look at those basics again, and then teach people the meaning of those things. What's the symbolism involved? What's the biblical history? How has this developed through Christian history? And what are the variations you can find as you move from one church to another? We try to explain what those differences might be.
The forward, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, talks about the ancient fathers of East and West were indeed the original tour guides and experts on the meaning of our church buildings, their furnishings and iconography, their reflection on the relics of the martyrs. And in the preface, you've got Father Robert Barron, very popular these days, talks about centuries ago, even when ordinary believers knew how to read a church. What does that mean? I never heard that expression until I saw this book, Reading a Church.
Well, when you walk into a church, you see a lot of different components, a lot of different parts, and some of them are puzzling. You don't see those things in other places. And some of them have strange names, like an ambo or an ambry. And you might not know the meaning of these words, you don't know the history, but it's all trying to communicate something to you. And sometimes they're covered with these strange symbols, and you don't know what the symbols are either. So we try to teach people how to read these things and understand them, but then also how to pray them. Because who is it that's the subject of this communication? Who's trying to communicate with you? Well, it's God. And all of the symbols we use in the church, they're based on divine revelation. God is trying to communicate something to us. When we respond, then we elevate this communication to prayer.
Now, elsewhere in the foreword, the Cardinal goes on to say, in a fresh and interesting way, this book opens us up again to the meaning of mystagogy, that beautiful patristic way of using the places and spaces of our buildings to draw us deeper into the experience of sacred scripture and the sacraments, the understanding of our Catholic faith. Now, that's an expression you only hear when the RCIA program is going on. Otherwise, nobody ever hears that word. What does it mean?
Well, mystagogy is a way of life for Catholics. It comes from Greek words that mean guidance in the mysteries. Well, all of these things are mysteries, and they're intended to draw us in so that we grow deeper in our understanding of them as our life goes on. When Father preaches his sermon and opens up the Scriptures to us, well, the Scriptures might be puzzling, they might be mysterious to us, but as he draws us in, and as he allows us, enables us, empowers us to go deeper, well, we grow in our relationship with God. So that's what we're trying to do with the church, to draw people deeper into the church so that they understand what are the components, what they mean, and why are those components there for them in particular. Mystagogy is the way of the fathers, as Cardinal DiNardo pointed out. So the Cardinal Wuerl and I, as we put this book together, we relied on the ancient fathers in a great way. I mean, we use Eusebius and a lot of
to show that these things are not just accretions that were added on.
That's
or that
right.
There was some reason why, and also how it's integral to our worship, right?
That's right. This is the way Catholics have always done things. You know, we develop and
Yeah, because obviously you talk about, I mean, we started in home churches, obviously, that weren't the dual ambo and the nave and everything, but I guess there was in its own way, right?
Well, there was, right. But as we kind of stretch out, we have more freedom, we did more with the space we had at our disposal. We always wanted to give the best to God. Even when it was a house church, we would still give the best tableware to God. And we never wanted to skimp on those things. And even today, Doug, when you travel around the world, you go to these countries where the practice of the faith is limited by law or even persecuted.
Persecuted, right? Yeah.
You know, you go to these places and they still try to do the best for God all the time.
Right, and you also talk even in different places around the world where you would go to a particular location where obviously people there are fairly destitute or poor, and you go to the church and there you find the finest things. You know what I mean? And sometimes that's looked down on in a negative way, as if somehow the church is holding it. But it's really because people want to give what little best they have. They want that for God.
That's right. And you know, the novelist Mary McCarthy once told a story about being with the tour, going through these churches, and they're going into these poor villages that had lavish churches. And the people on the tour said what Judas said, you know, why don't they sell these things and feed the poor? Well, if you sold everything in that church, you would feed the poor for maybe a week, but probably not more than that. And after that, you would leave them culturally destitute, spiritually destitute. You would leave them with nothing. You know, there's kind of a classist assumption behind that the poor don't need art, that the poor don't want these spiritual treasures.
They don't understand it.
That's right. Put them in a museum where the wealthy can enjoy them. No. This is what we raise to God. We give God our best.
Yeah, this elitism. Father Barron also says, and many theologians and spiritual writers of the last half century so emphasize the fact that church means the people of God as opposed to the building itself. And you go on, and as we said before, the result of two influences was beige churches, largely empty gathering spaces devoid of color, symbolism, and artistic texture. I have to admit, the one word I can't stand, that phrase, you know, this is our sacred space, you know, is like, I understand the gathering space as being at a church, but, you know, this idea of the sacred space as opposed to it being a church.
Well, you know, if it's truly a sacred space, it should look like a church.
Right, exactly.
Because you know, Moses found the burning bush. He took off his shoes. You know, we find that all through the Old Testament, that when you're in a sacred space, it instills awe.
Well, Israel with the temple, of course,
right.
The same thing, right?
Right. You give the best to God, and you reflect that sacredness in the architecture, in the decoration, in everything you do.
Right, and that's why some people saw with the kind of the people Magal motif, the circular church, in a sense where people are looking at each other as opposed to looking at God.
Awkward.
And also, for example, they tell us how the cruciform design of most classical ecclesial buildings is meant to evoke the human body itself. I never really thought of it that way.
Right, it's supposed to reflect the crucified body of Christ. And we are gathered and filling the body, living out every Sunday and every holy day what St. Paul describes in his letters.
Now you say, in the beginning you said, we approach our subject from two distinct viewpoints. One of us is a cardinal archbishop, the other is a married layman. Working together, we hope to share a panoramic vision of our churches. So how is it different? Is one from the altar out and one's from the pew up? Or what's the different perspective you saw in putting this book together with the Cardinal?
Well, I've known Cardinal Wuerl for a long time, and we've had a running conversation for 20-some years now. So what I always note is that he really does look at the church as a father in the church, and I look at it very much as a son. And I look at it from the perspective of the pews, because that's where I experience the Mass. That's where I experience the preaching. He looks at it as a preacher, as a priest, as the man who stands at the altar. He's been a priest for almost a half century now. So we have two very different perspectives, and what we tried to do, not only in this book, but in the book before it, on the Mass, we tried to bring those two perspectives together to illuminate one another.
Now we also talk about the idea of a Catholic identity. Is there a Catholic identity, and is the church an important part of that Catholic identity?
Absolutely, there's a Catholic identity, because so many of these elements that you find in a Catholic church, you're not going to find anywhere else. You know, you go to the bank, you're not going to find an ambry. You go to the hospital, you're not going to find a baptismal font. These things are particular to our churches, and they really do make us who we are. Not only in a metaphorical way, Doug, but in a real way, because we're born from that baptismal font. It's our mother to a great extent, to the realist extent. So we have a certain love because the church gives birth to us, because the church feeds us as a mother.
The Catholic thing, so to speak.
The Catholic thing,
Catholic
it's
thing,
sacramental.
right.
We're surrounded by angels and saints.
I thought this was interesting. It says, the early Christians said that when Jesus descended into the river Jordan, he sanctified, made holy all the waters of the earth, commissioning them for the task of baptism. I had never thought about that. It's a great image. In his mother's womb, he sanctified motherhood. At a family table, God handled ordinary food and made it to signify the otherwise unimaginable heavenly banquet. He wandered in the desert and traveled in boats and visited towns and cities. In doing all this, he blessed creation and hallowed it as a sign of his eternal life. Every Catholic church is built to tell this story.
Yes, yes.
Right.
That's the whole message of the Incarnation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Right. And so, all of those places where he dwelt, where he walked, are now sacred sites. And people throng there by the millions to visit the places where Jesus walked, and they become sacred space, as you said before. But you know what? Our churches are the places where the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. And those are sacred places, holy sites, and that's why we build our churches to be beautiful. It's important that we understand them for what they are.
Now you go and say a church is a building with a useful purpose, like a firehouse or a hospital. It provides a public service. That's the root meaning of the word liturgy. And then you say this may seem contradictory for a church to be a quote-unquote public building, yet at the same time a sacred place. But it's not contradictory in your mind.
No, it's
not.
Why not? Because the liturgy is the work of the people. You know, it's a place where the people can gather. We don't bar the door. And it's a welcoming place. It's a family place, but it's our public building. It's the building we share. The liturgy is a public event. There are all kinds of protections in canon law so that people are not prevented from attending the liturgy or getting into their parish churches.
Now, a church is built for the sake of the altar inside. The altar is built for the sake of the Mass, and the Mass is offered for the glory of God, for the salvation of His people. Do you think we've lost that in some ways?
Oh, yeah. You know, with what you were describing before, the way some churches are set up, it almost obscures the altar, or it relativizes it. You know, it makes
it's not an altar; it's a table.
Or it's off center, and
right,
it's just as important as the back pew. But in the traditional Catholic understanding of a church building, everything is oriented toward the altar. And we quote the philosopher Joseph Pieper, who says that a church is built for the sake of the altar, and everything else is more or less just a shelter for the altar. The people go there to attend the sacrifice of the Mass. And this sets us apart from everything else. If you visit ancient temples, there's no place for a congregation. The temple was just the
Right,
place
you
of
talked
sacrifice.
about that here. Yeah, that was interesting too.
And that's it.
Yeah, right.
There's no
and a
one
lot of times the people didn't go there, just the priests who would offer the sacrifice.
That's right. You could have the sacrificial victim sent there on your behalf, and it would be offered, but you didn't have to be there.
Right.
This is a radical reorienting of religion so that the people are brought into the sacrifice and they offer it as a priestly people.
You say, what is the church? And you say the English word church has ancient and beautiful origins, Greek, etc. The Lord's belonging to the Lord.
So this is a special thing. It belongs to the Lord, and that's why we should want it to be the best. We should want it to be beautiful because it's His, and it's not like He needs beauty or He needs wealth. He owns everything already. But it's symbolic of what we're giving to Him, and it's symbolic really of what He's given to us. We return the best to Him as a gift.
Right, right. Church means something universal and cosmic, at the same time something local and intimate. It means something spiritual, at the same time something concrete. So doesn't that make, it seems like it means everything.
Well, it's the sacramental principle. God is transcendent. God transcends time. God transcends space. He's eternal. He's infinite. And yet, He broke through what's our glass ceiling. He broke through the glass floor to become flesh and dwell among us in a particular time, in a particular place. Wow. So He embodied this reality on earth. And He established a church. And He established the church in a visible way with a visible head when He commissioned St. Peter. And so this church had a very particular visible life, and we see it in the Acts of the Apostles as the primitive community gathered for the teaching of the apostles and the communion, the breaking of the bread, and the prayers. They gathered together for this purpose and for these rites, and we still do today.
Say, in every church, invisible realities shine through the visible ornaments. Something spiritual shines through all the material elements inside and out. A church is filled with natural pleasures, but in their context, in church, they conspire to lead Christians to a worship that is supernatural.
Yes, yes. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to meaningless ritual or meaningless ornament. Well, if you don't get the meaning, that's not the fault of the ornament. That's not the fault of the ritual. It's because you haven't taken the time to get to know these things. You know, Doug, I have 6 kids. And at a certain point in their upbringing, you have to take those kids aside and say, I'm going to introduce you to the use of the washing machine or the dryer or the dishwasher. And it's important that they come to know what these installations are, what they're for, what they mean, and how to use them. As Catholics, sometimes we never allow ourselves to be brought to that point. So we walk by these installations in our churches. We have no idea what they mean, what they're for, and yet God Himself has established them there for us. We're missing out on so much if we don't know about the churches we attend every Sunday.
Well, you've got some even just basic information like what a cathedral is, where that comes from, and of course it ties into the chair, right? And we see here ex cathedra sometimes people when the Pope speaks on something on doctrine.
That's right. It's his chair of authority, and that's an ancient practice, as we point out in the book. It goes back not only to the origins of the church, but before that.
Right, the chair of Moses.
The chair of Moses, and the chair in the synagogue, and the chair even in the pagan philosophers, they taught from a chair. It was tradition.
Well, even just information on what a basilica is versus what a shrine might be, a chapel, an oratory, a crypt, a baptistry. So even just basic information here as well. One of the words, everybody I think has a general idea where the sanctuary is. The nave, always is the church's central open space, usually extending from the sanctuary to the front entryway of the church. Since most Christian churches were built in the shape of a cruciform man, the nave signifies His body. The laity are not simply members of the church, but members of Christ.
Yes, yes. So we try to get into that theologically. Often people skip over that part as if it's unimportant, as if the pews are somehow incidental to the church. But the presence of the people is so important in the church, and so we spend some time talking about that theologically and drawing from the saints' reflections on this part of the church.
Well, you could say here in the section on the altar, religion of the Bible is a sacrificial religion, and sacrifices require priests to perform them and altars on which they can be performed. Why did it seem to be that there seemed to be this? In a sense, at least the impression for the person in the pew that maybe the sacrificial altar aspect was being downplayed versus a more Thanksgiving banquet kind of thing, Eucharista.
Yeah, I think that It's a product of the 60s and of a misguided ecumenism in some cases. Because the Protestant Reformation rejected the sacrificial dimension of the liturgy, which had been there in tradition since the very beginning of the church. But because the reformers rejected that, many people wanted to downplay it in order to try to encourage a reunion of the churches. That's one reason. Another reason is perhaps also a certain distaste for it because it seems to smack of primitive religion, bloody sacrifices and that sort of thing.
Right, and a hierarchy, which
which is all of these things are taboos.
We don't like that so much,
Right.
But unfortunately, you have a God that creates a hierarchy right there, whether we like it or not. Well, in the section on pews and kneelers, you say Catholic worship is distinctive in terms of the postures and gestures prescribed for the congregation. Converts often say they need time to adjust to the Sunday round of standing, sitting, kneeling, and standing again. It's a form of communication, body language that expresses the range of an individual's relations with God.
Yes.
Because some people look at that and say, why are you jumping up and down, and why are we doing all of this?
Well, it's for our sake. Again, God knows our hearts, and He knows what we're thinking at all times, and He knows the quality of our worship. So it's not as if He needs us to kneel for some reason. It's for our sake, so that we remind ourselves of where we are in relation to God.
And what's happening at that point in time, maybe.
Yes.
Whether, exactly, and you're standing for the gospel, and you're, let's say, kneeling during the consecration, that you realize, and again, it's how we act in our lives, how we dress, is reflective of how we feel interiorly about something.
And if we don't,
and its importance.
If we don't do those things, if I don't walk over to my wife and give her a kiss, you have to make habits of these things, or we begin to forget. We begin to change interiorly, and we begin to lose that fire of love that we need to tend in order to keep it burning.
Right, because we live in a material world where we have these outward signs of what's going on inside.
And God made us as material beings.
Right.
We're not pure spirits like the angels.
Right. A church's interior should reflect the church's theology of the laity. Worshippers are not spectators at the liturgy.
We're baptized into Christ's priesthood. So there is this common priesthood that we share. We all share a priestly function. We're all placing an offering on the altar. During the liturgy, the priest, our ordained priests, are offering the body and blood of Jesus Christ as He commanded when He said, "Do this in memory of me." We are there to consecrate the world. So we bring our families, our homes, all of the things we produce at work, all of the things we do at leisure, we bring all of those things to church with us in our hearts, in our minds, and we place them on the altar. And they are sanctified along with the gifts of the altar.
In a sense, and that's the representative of the lay people bringing the gifts up.
Right. This is the consequence of the incarnation. Jesus Christ came to share this life with us.
Now, in working on this book with the Cardinal, how did you go back and forth? Email back and forth and things like that?
A lot of email. The other thing is the Cardinal has been a priest for 50 years. He served in Rome in the Congregation for the Clergy for a decade and more. And he's been writing a lot. He's been preaching a lot for all these years. So some years ago when we started working together, he just kind of gave me access to all of these files.
You were able to kind of...
And I work with a lot of his files, and then we start emailing
back and forth as you got it into some sort of form that you could look at.
And we meet together fairly regularly.
Well, in reading through his material, was there an insight into the church that he presented that was new to you?
Well, it's intense. It's newly intense, and I worked with him. I worked for him for 3 years, and I don't know that I've ever met anyone who loves the church so much. He works with an intensity. He works in an untiring way, and I don't know too many people who work as many hours as he does. He has given his life to the church in a beautiful way, and that's inspiring. It always has been inspiring to me, and it was good for us. It was good to work with him on a book about the church and have him apply it in that particular way.
Now, you wrote this book as a follow-up to the Mass. Do you need to have that other book to really appreciate this, or you can deal with each one?
They're standalone, and we've even finished our work on a third one called The Feasts, which walks through the church calendar. That'll be out next.
So maybe I'll corral you the next time to sit down and talk about that.
I would love it.
Maybe when you come and visit us at EWTN land.
I would love that too.
All right, thanks, Mike. Good luck with your new series with Dr. Hahn as well. Happy to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you about the great work. Mike Aquilina talking about the book, The Church Unlocking the Secrets to the Places Catholics Call Home, which he co-wrote with Cardinal Donald Wuerl, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Thank you for joining us for this special EWTN on location from Franciscan University in Steubenville. I'm Doug Keck. See you next time.